What if the God we know from the Bible wasn't always the only God? In the ancient world of Israel and Canaan, Yahweh was not alone. There was El, the mighty Father of gods, worshipped long before Israel's rise. Over centuries, something profound happened. Yahweh absorbed the identity of El, reshaping the very foundation of faith. In this video, we'll uncover how Yahweh became the God of the Bible, what happened to El, and how this transformation changed religion forever. Get ready to explore hidden history, lost gods, and the making of monotheism's greatest story. The God of the Bible, known as Yahweh, is today considered the eternal, all-powerful, and singular creator of the universe. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, He is the one God above all others, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. But when we turn back the pages of history and study the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible alongside archaeology and ancient Near Eastern texts, a surprising picture emerges. Yahweh was not always alone, nor was He always the central divine figure of Israelite religion. In fact, the earliest Israelites lived in a world filled with gods, and the supreme figure in that pantheon was El, the Most High, the Father of gods and humans. So what happened? How did Yahweh, once a regional deity of storm and war, rise to absorb El's identity and become the one God of the Bible? This question takes us deep into the religious transformation of the ancient Near East, showing us how gods rise, merge, and disappear, and how the story of Yahweh and El reveals the birth of monotheism itself. The ancient Canaanite world, a pantheon of gods. To understand Yahweh's rise, we must begin with the world of the Canaanites, the cultural cousins and neighbors of the Israelites. Archaeology from Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra in Syria, uncovered texts from around 1200 BCE that describe a divine council headed by El, the Father of years, the wise old Creator God. He was the ultimate authority, a distant but revered figure. Alongside El was his consort Ashura, the mother goddess, who nurtured life. Their children included a host of gods such as Baal, the storm and fertility god, who fought battles to bring rain and fertility, and Anat, the fierce goddess of war. In this pantheon, El was supreme, Baal was active and powerful, and Ashura was nurturing and essential. This religious world deeply influenced the early Israelites, who lived in the same cultural landscape. The Bible itself preserves echoes of this pantheon. For example, in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9, we read, in some versions, "When the Most High El-Elyon gave the nations their inheritance, He divided mankind. He fixed the borders of the peoples, according to the number of the sons of God. But Yahweh's portion is His people, Jacob His allotted inheritance." Here we see El-Elyon, the Most High, dividing the nations among divine beings, with Yahweh receiving Israel as His portion. This passage reflects a worldview where El stands above, and Yahweh is one of many divine sons. Clearly, Yahweh was not yet the sole God. Yahweh's origins, a southern deity. So, who was Yahweh originally? Evidence suggests He began as a deity from the southern deserts, perhaps associated with Midian, Edom, or Sinai. Egyptian texts from the 14th to 13th centuries BC mention a place called Yahu in the land of the Shesu, referring to nomadic tribes in the south. The Bible itself associates Yahweh's earliest appearances with southern regions. Deuteronomy 33 verse 2. Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. Judges 5 verse 4. Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom. This suggests that Yahweh was originally a regional storm and war god worshipped by tribes outside Canaan, later adopted by Israelites as they settled in the land. At this stage, Yahweh was not identical with El, but rather one among many gods. perhaps even a younger deity. Yahweh meets El, merging identities. As Israelite religion developed, something remarkable happened. Yahweh began to absorb the roles and titles of El. Instead of remaining a separate southern deity, Yahweh took on El's characteristics as the high God. Clues to this merger are scattered throughout the Bible. Yahweh is called El Elyon, the Most High, in Psalm 7 verse 17 and elsewhere. In Genesis 17 verse 1, God appears to Abraham as El Shaddai, God Almighty, a title linked to El, but later identified with Yahweh. In Exodus 6 verses 2 to 3, God says, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself fully known to them. This verse reflects a theological attempt to merge two traditions. The patriarchs worshipped El, but Moses and Israel came to know that El and Yahweh were one and the same. In other words, Israelite tradition rewrote its past, so that Yahweh became not just Israel's God, but the supreme God, El himself. The role of Asherah, the forgotten consort. The archaeological record reveals that Asherah, the goddess consort of El, was also associated with Yahweh in early Israelite religion. Inscriptions from Kuntalat-Idrud, 8th century BCE, mention blessings given by Yahweh and his Asherah. This suggests that in some communities, Yahweh was not alone, but worshipped alongside a goddess. Later biblical writers, particularly the prophets, railed against this practice, calling it idolatry. For example, Jeremiah condemns those who made offerings to the Queen of Heaven. The Deuteronomistic reformers of the 7th century BCE worked hard to erase Asherah from official worship, solidifying Yahweh as a singular, exclusive deity. The suppression of Asherah was crucial in the shift from polytheism or henotheism, worship of one God without denying others, to strict monotheism, from divine counsel to monotheism. Early Israelite religion envisioned Yahweh as part of a divine council, much like the Canaanite pantheon. Psalm 82 describes God presiding over the assembly of gods and pronouncing judgment on them. Similarly, Job speaks of the sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh. But over time, the council of God shrank. The divine beings were reinterpreted as angels or subordinate messengers, and Yahweh alone remained supreme. This process of reinterpretation allowed Israelite tradition to preserve older myths without abandoning its move toward monotheism. By the time of the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, prophets like Isaiah were proclaiming Yahweh not just as Israel's God, but as the only God in existence. Isaiah 45 verse 5, I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me there is no God. Here, the merger is complete. Yahweh is El, and El is Yahweh. The other gods are either false, powerless, or redefined as angels. Historical forces behind the transformation. Religious ideas do not evolve in a vacuum. They respond to historical and political realities. Several forces drove the rise of Yahweh as the one God. National identity. As Israel sought to distinguish itself from Canaanite neighbors, fusing Yahweh with El allowed them to claim the supreme God as their own while rejecting rival gods like Baal. Monarchic centralization. Under kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, worship was centralized in Jerusalem. Competing shrines and gods were suppressed, leaving Yahweh as the sole focus of national religion. The Babylonian exile. When Jerusalem was destroyed and Israel went into exile, the people reinterpreted disaster not as Yahweh's weakness, but as his universal power. He was not just Israel's God, but the God of all nations, the one who controlled history itself. Through these crises, the vision of Yahweh expanded from a tribal deity to the universal creator. What happened to El? If Yahweh became El, what became of the older God? In a sense, El did not disappear, he was absorbed. His name survives in biblical titles. El Elyon, God Most High. El Shaddai, God Almighty. El Olam, Everlasting God. Even the very word Israel means El rules, or El perseveres. Yet for biblical writers, these names and titles were no longer separate deities, but attributes of Yahweh. El was too central to discard, so instead, Israelite religion rewrote its theology. El and Yahweh were always the same. What looked historically like a merger was theologically reframed as a deeper revelation of Yahweh's eternal identity. The legacy of the transformation. The merging of Yahweh and El created the foundation for the great monotheistic traditions. Without this transformation, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as we know them would not exist. Judaism inherited the strict monotheism of the exilic and post-exilic prophets, seeing Yahweh as the one creator and lawgiver. Christianity carried this further, identifying Yahweh as the Father of Jesus, while reinterpreting divine unity through the Trinity. Islam later proclaimed Allah as the one God, drawing on the same Near Eastern tradition, with echoes of El's name still present, El/Allah. Thus, the forgotten story of El lives on indirectly in the religions that reshaped the world. Gods remembered and forgotten. The question, what happened to El, is both simple and profound. Historically, El was the high god of Canaan, worshipped for centuries before the Israelites rose to prominence. He was the Father of years, the Ancient of Days, the supreme deity in the pantheon of the Levant. Yet today, El survives only as a faint echo. His name preserved in biblical titles, in personal names like Israel, Samuel, and Gabriel, and in the silent layers of archaeology. El is not alone in this fate. Across human history, gods have risen to dominance only to fade into obscurity. They are remembered for a time, reinterpreted by later traditions, or forgotten altogether, buried beneath the sands of cultural change. Yahweh, originally one among many storm deities of the southern deserts, rose above his rivals, absorbed El's titles, and became the supreme God of heaven and earth. El, in turn, was remembered but transformed, folded into Yahweh's identity. This story is not unique. The history of religion is filled with gods remembered and forgotten, remembered through names, stories, or symbols, but forgotten as independent beings of worship. Understanding this process not only illuminates the ancient world, but also reveals something universal about human spirituality. The way divine memory is shaped by power, culture, and time. El, the forgotten high god. In the Canaanite pantheon, El was the supreme deity, the patriarch of gods and humanity. He sat enthroned at the source of rivers, presiding over the divine council. His consort, Asherah, was the mother of the gods, and their children included Baal, Anat, and others. El was not the stormy, active warrior. He was the elder, wise and majestic, granting authority to his offspring. Biblical tradition preserves fragments of this older religious world. In Deuteronomy 32 verses 8-9, the Most High, El Elyon, divides the nations among the sons of God, with Yahweh receiving Israel as a share. In other words, El was originally the great high God, Yahweh one of his sons. Yet as Israel's religion evolved, Yahweh began to absorb El's identity. The names remained El Elyon, El Shaddai, El Olam, but their meaning shifted. They were no longer separate deities, but titles of Yahweh himself. El was not denied. He was remembered and redefined. But in that act of reinterpretation, he was also forgotten. Yahweh's ascent. Yahweh began as a storm and warrior deity worshipped by tribes in the southern deserts, Midian, Edom, and Sinai. Early biblical poetry echoes this. Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Syripanus, Deuteronomy 33 verse 2. Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom. Judges 5 verse 4. From these roots, Yahweh rose to prominence in Israel as a God of battles, a bringer of storms and victories. Over time, as the Israelites sought a singular identity distinct from their Canaanite neighbors, Yahweh took on El's mantle. He was no longer a local God, but the high God, the Creator, the ruler of nations. This ascent was not just theological, it was political. As monarchs centralized worship in Jerusalem, they sought one unifying deity for the people. Yahweh became that figure, merging El's transcendence with his own warrior strength. The forgotten El lived on inside Yahweh, his memory preserved but transformed. The fate of forgotten gods. El's story is not unique. The history of religion is a graveyard of forgotten gods. The once mighty Zeus of Greece, Jupiter of Rome, Ra of Egypt, and Odin of the Norse world, all were once supreme beings, worshipped with temples, sacrifices, and prayers. Today, they exist only in mythology, literature, and cultural memory. Some gods vanish completely, their names erased, their images shattered by rivals. Others live on, remembered in fragments, absorbed into new religions, or transformed into angels, demons, or saints. For example, Baal, once a rival to Yahweh, was demonized in biblical tradition. His name turned into a symbol of false worship. Asherah, Yahweh's consort in some traditions, was erased from official religion, though echoes of the Queen of Heaven linger in Jeremiah. Ishtar/Inanna, the great Mesopotamian goddess, survived faintly in the figure of Astarte and later left traces in stories of Aphrodite and Venus. The line between remembered and forgotten is often thin. Gods rarely disappear suddenly. They fade, transform, or are reinterpreted. Memory, power, and the divine. Why do some gods survive while others vanish? The answer lies in the interplay of memory, power, and cultural transformation. Political power. Gods tied to strong empires thrive as long as the empire thrives. When the empire falls, their gods often collapse with it. The fall of Rome ended Jupiter's reign. The fall of Egypt weakened Ra's cult. Cultural adaptation. Some gods survive by adapting. El survived by being merged into Yahweh. Greek gods survived in literature and art long after their temples were abandoned. Religious reinterpretation. Conquering religions often reinterpret older gods as demons, saints, or symbols. Christianity absorbed pagan festivals, saints' cults, and even temple sites. Islam redefined pre-Islamic Arabian deities as false gods. Names and language. Even when forgotten, gods leave linguistic traces. Words like El God, Deus, Theos, or Allah carry echoes of earlier divine figures. Memory, then, is not just about belief, but about survival in the cultural imagination. El was remembered because his name was too deeply embedded in Israel's identity to erase. Other gods were forgotten because their cults could be destroyed or replaced. The divine council, from gods to angels. One striking example of transformation is the fate of the divine council. In early Israelite religion, Yahweh presided over a council of gods, the sons of El, the heavenly host. This reflects the broader Canaanite pattern of a high god ruling a pantheon. But as monotheism took root, these gods could no longer be acknowledged as real. Instead, they were reinterpreted as angels, messengers of the one God. Psalm 82, which speaks of God judging the gods, was reinterpreted as Yahweh rebuking corrupt spiritual beings, no longer true deities. Here we see gods remembered but forgotten, acknowledged in the text but stripped of divinity, their memory reshaped into something that fit the new monotheistic worldview. Forgotten gods and the human psyche. Why does humanity remember some gods and forget others? The answer may lie deeper than politics. Gods embody archetypes, forces of nature, aspects of human life, and mysteries of existence. When cultures change, the archetypes remain, even if the gods' names change. The storm god Baal fades, but the archetype of the stormy warrior survives in Yahweh, Zeus, Thor. The mother goddess Asherah disappears, but her archetype reappears in figures like Isis, Demeter, Mary. The high god El vanishes, but his archetype survives in the transcendent creator of monotheism. Thus, no god is ever completely forgotten. Their names may fade, but their roles, images, and powers are recycled in new religious forms. Remembering through forgetting. El's story reveals a paradox. Sometimes, to remember a god, you must forget him. El was not erased violently, but redefined until he ceased to exist as a distinct figure. His memory is preserved in the Bible, but only as a title of Yahweh. In this way, El was both remembered and forgotten. This paradox applies broadly. Ancient gods survive in myths, in language, in cultural memory. They are forgotten as living beings of worship, but remembered in the imagination of humanity. Literature, art, and folklore become the new temples where forgotten gods reside. The modern rediscovery of forgotten gods. Archaeology has played a crucial role in resurrecting the memory of forgotten gods. Before the discovery of Ugaritic texts in 1928, El was little more than a shadow in the Bible. Now, scholars can read myths about El, Baal, and Asherah, reconstructing the world in which Israelite religion emerged. Similarly, excavations in Mesopotamia brought back Inanna, Enlil, and Marduk from oblivion. The pyramids of Egypt restored Ra, Osiris, and Isis to the modern imagination. The sagas of Scandinavia revived Odin and Thor. Forgotten gods once erased now live again in scholarship, literature, and even popular culture. They remind us that memory is never final. Gods can be resurrected in new forms whenever humanity seeks meaning in the past. Gods remembered and forgotten, a universal story. The story of El and Yahweh is a particular example of a universal truth. Gods are shaped by human history, memory, and forgetting. They rise when communities need them, fade when empires fall, and survive in fragments, echoes, or transformations. Some gods are remembered through continuity. Yahweh, transformed into the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Some gods are remembered through myth and literature. Zeus, Ra, Odin. Some gods are remembered through archetypes, their essence living on in new forms. Some gods are forgotten almost completely, leaving only faint names on broken tablets. Yet none are entirely lost. Human memory, like a great archive, preserves even forgotten gods in some form. The question, what happened to El, leads us into the heart of religious memory. El, once the supreme god of Canaan, was remembered by Israel but transformed, merged into Yahweh, and forgotten as an independent deity. Yahweh, in turn, rose from a local storm god to the one God of the Bible, reshaping history forever. But El's story is also the story of countless other gods, remembered in fragments, forgotten in worship, yet alive in human imagination. The gods of old are never entirely gone. They live in our words, our myths, our archetypes, and our search for meaning. To study gods remembered and forgotten is to study humanity itself. Our fears, our hopes, our empires, our collapses, and our endless need to give form to the mysteries of existence. In remembering El, even as we forget him, we see how the divine is both eternal and fragile, always changing, yet never entirely gone. The story of Yahweh and El reveals a hidden chapter in the history of faith, a moment when gods merged, traditions shifted, and the path toward monotheism was forged. What began as a world of many divine powers transformed into the singular vision that shaped the Bible and the religions that followed. But what does this tell us about how belief evolves and how memory of forgotten gods lingers beneath the surface? If you found this exploration eye-opening, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys into history's deepest mysteries and the unseen roots of faith.